In previous lectures, we learned that philosophers are ultimately after truth, specifically knowledge of the truth. We don't just want true beliefs, we want to know what's true. In order to get to that, there are two important questions to ask. What is knowledge and what is truth? The former is the topic of this entire section. The latter is the topic of this lecture. But let's make sure and be clear. We're not asking what is true. There's a whole collection of true propositions out there, and figuring out among all the propositions which ones are true and which ones are false is not something we could ever accomplish. No, instead, we're wondering about the nature of truth itself, what it takes for a proposition to be true. But why, we might wonder, is discovering the nature of truth relevant to discovering the nature of knowledge? Well, ironically enough, to understand why, we need to start by asking the question of this entire section. What is knowledge? So, first, ask yourself, can you know something without believing it? Is it possible to know that Barack Obama is the 44th President of the United States, but not believe that Barack Obama is the 44th President of the United States? It doesn't seem so. To know something is to believe it. Indeed, knowledge is a certain kind of belief. Did you know that I once launched a 19-foot kite with my nephew Colby? It belonged to my high school bus driver Milton. That we once got a 7-foot kite 3,000 feet in the air. It took us an hour and a half to reel that thing back in. Or once I used a 14-foot kite to fly a University of Oklahoma flag behind a moving boat. Did you know that I once stupidly flew a 5-meter parafoil kite, which is basically just a parachute, in 25-mile-an-hour winds in Oklahoma behind my parents' house? I actually have a video of that one. Of course you didn't know any of that. You didn't know that I was that much of a nerd, and you likely held no beliefs about my kite flying prowess before now. But now, since I've told you, you do hold the belief and you now have knowledge. But consider this. Can you know something that is false? Now, I'm not asking whether you can know that something is false or whether you can believe something is true when it in fact is false. Of course you can. People do such things all the time. I'm asking whether you can actually know something that actually is false. Can you know that Thomas Jefferson was the second president? Can you know that you are not listening to this lecture right now? Of course not, because those things are false. Jefferson was the third president, and you are clearly listening to this lecture. Knowledge requires truth. So, knowledge is a certain kind of belief. It's true belief. To know something, it is necessary to believe that thing and for that thing to be true. But is that enough? So the third question, how many keys do I have in my pocket? I'll give you a hint. It's between 1 and 10. Got a number in your head? Okay. And for the sake of the example, really commit to it. Believe that I have that many keys in my pocket. Now, given the number of people listening to this lecture, someone guessed correctly. Someone has a true belief. But does anybody have knowledge? They know how many keys are in my pocket. Seems not. Even if you guessed right and have a true belief, you do not have knowledge. So knowledge, it seems, is more than mere true belief. But let's look. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Do the persons who guessed right now know? Those who guessed 5? Do you now know how many keys I have in my pocket? Of course. But what's been added? Evidence, justification. You saw me hold the key ring and count the keys. And so we now seem to have a fairly complete picture of what knowledge is. A true belief that is justified. The justified true belief, or JTB definition of knowledge, has been standard pretty much since Plato expressed it as true judgment with an account in the Theaetetus. Ironically, Plato actually rejected this definition in favor of one grounded in knowledge of what he called the forms, and we'll talk about forms later. And actually, in the 20th century, a philosopher named Edmund Gettier caused big problems for the JTB definition by showing that one can have justified true belief but still lack knowledge. We'll talk about that in a couple of lectures. But philosophers still agree that justification is at least required for knowledge. That's why we spent so much time talking about argument and evidence in the first couple of lectures. But philosophers still agree that you can't know something unless it is true. So, in order to find knowledge, we must seek true belief. Thus, we need to understand what truth is. We need to know not only what it takes for a belief to be true, but what it means for a belief to be true. To get to the bottom of this, we're going to look at three theories. We're going to look at pragmatism, coherence theory of truth, and the correspondence theory. First, the pragmatists. Classically, they include Charles Sanders Peirce, William James, and John Dewey. The name pragmatism comes from the Greek pragma, meaning act or deed or practice. Pragmatists seek to take ideas and theories out of our minds, so to speak, and connect them to what we would do or how we behave in the world. How would the world be different if what I believed were true? Now, pragmatists solve many philosophical problems practically. Consider one of my favorite examples. Suppose you are walking around a tree. At the same time, a squirrel is crawling around the trunk of the tree in such a way that the squirrel's back is always to you as you go around the tree. Now, clearly, you are walking around the tree, but are you walking around the squirrel? After all, the squirrel's back is always to you, so how could you really be walking around it? The solution, pragmatist William James suggests, depends on what you practically mean by around. What is it exactly that you're trying to do? As I put it, are you trying to be north, then west, then south, then east of the squirrel? Is that what you mean by around? Well, then yes, you went around the squirrel. But if you meant that you were facing the back, the right, the front, and then the left of the squirrel, well then no, you did not accomplish what you wanted. The squirrel's back was always to you. The initial question was confusing because it was not clear what you wanted to accomplish, what you practically meant by the word around. And once we clear that up, well, there's nothing really left to be said. There's no additional philosophical problem to solve. It's not like one goal is better than the other or that there's some kind of right use of the word around. And although this might be a bit simplistic, it seems that many philosophical problems can be solved by simply being clear about what your words practically mean. Charles Sanders Peirce had a very pragmatic view of meaning. He wanted to get ideas out of heads and tie words to the world. So, for example, we can parse out what you mean by saying something is solid or hard by tying it directly to how it behaves in the world. How it would be, say, scratched by other objects. We might think of the Mohs scale of hardness. Talc is lowest on the scale since it can be scratched by anything. Diamond is highest since it can only be scratched by another diamond. Hardness is not an idea in your mind, it's something right there in the world. Now, different pragmatists had different ways of approaching truth, but the essence of pragmatism is to define what is true by what words. It's actually debatable as to whether Peirce's theory of truth is, technically speaking, pragmatic, but such labels really need not concern us. Peirce was particularly interested in scientific truth, and he noticed that we gain such knowledge by making successful predictions about what will happen in experimental conditions. But that's not the whole story. After all, a belief or theory can make successful predictions, yet the propositions the theory entails can still be false. Take, for example, Newton's theories about the nature of the universe and the force of gravity. With them, he was able to develop laws that made very successful predictions about planetary motion. But it turned out Newton's theory was false. As we've already discussed, Einstein's theory of relativity overturned it. But notice how this happened. We discovered that Newton was incorrect because his laws occasionally got the predictions wrong. But that's the nice thing about science. It's self-correcting. When it gets something wrong, science ensures that other scientists will eventually identify the mistake and correct it. In fact, science, at least according to Peirce, is the only discipline or method that has this noble quality. Because of this quality, we need not reject any current scientific theory based on the expectation that it will eventually be proven false and thrown out. A new, more accurate theory may come along, but old theories can still be useful. Although Newton's theory is strictly speaking false, most of its predictions are accurate. So we are justified in believing many things that it tells us, like what it says about most motions of the planets and medium-sized objects. We are justified in believing even more of what Einstein's theory tells us, and perhaps some future theory will be even more accurate and will be even more justified. The point is, we're always progressing in our understanding of the world and the way it works. And this helps us understand Peirce's theory of truth. For Peirce, that which is true is that which is the ultimate result of our scientific investigations, what is fated to be agreed upon by all those who investigate. It's the consensus at which we will eventually arrive through this process. What it means for something to be true is for it to be something that lies at the end of scientific inquiry. Now, it's important to note that this is not the same as identifying truth with the end of human scientific inquiry. After all, we may all die out or just simply quit before our inquiry is completed. Or maybe our inquiry will keep going, forever approaching but never encompassing the whole picture. None of those things would, according to Peirce, change what is true. That which is true is that which would be agreed upon by all parties if the process were ever completed properly. As a professor of mine from Oklahoma, Ken Merrill, once put it, Peirce, quote, would reject as logically nonsensical the possibility that a proposition might turn out to be false if it were reached on the basis of all possible evidence, end quote. But still, it seems this theory of truth is not quite right. That which is true may be that which would converge at the end of scientific investigation. But such convergence is not what makes something true. The fact that something is true is why we would converge on it. The reason it lies at the end of the investigation, the reason that it would be agreed to by all those who investigate, is because it's true. So even though accepting what would lie at the end of such an investigation is a guaranteed way to ensure that you have true beliefs, that is not what would make your beliefs true. Another shortcoming of this theory is that it only seems to account for scientific truth. Well, what about other kinds of truth, like ethical truth and aesthetic truth? Will a consensus eventually emerge on such topics? Will we ever agree on, say, the morality of abortion or whether Jackson Pollock is a good artist? What about religious truth, like God's existence? Another pragmatist, William James, tried to expand pragmatism's definition to include these kinds of truths, particularly religious truths. James suggested that if a belief has the power to help you organize all of your experience into a harmonious, satisfactory whole, then it's true. As James said in his book, Pragmatism, a New Name for Some Old Ways of Thinking, quote, ideas become true just insofar as they help us to get into satisfactory relation with other parts of our experience, end quote. This is somewhat related to Peirce's notion of truth for anything that helps us make successful predictions, helps us organize our experience into our harmonious whole. It's also very similar to our third pragmatist, John Dewey's theory of truth. In fact, it's so similar I won't bother delineating the difference. But since believing, say, that abortion is wrong and that God exists can help organize our experience into a harmonious whole, we can say they are true and make sense of what it means for them to be true. at least according to James. But the shortcoming of James' theory as an understanding of truth is, well, I think it's obvious. The fact that a belief can help organize our experience into our harmonious whole doesn't mean that it's true. Clearly, false beliefs can do this too. Bertrand Russell famously tried to make this point by suggesting that, according to James' theory of truth, one's belief in Santa Claus could be true. Now, this may not be completely fair to James. I don't think belief in Santa would really be true according to James' theory, because such belief could only be reconciled with your childhood experience, not your experience as a harmonious whole. But still, Russell's criticism is onto something. If people fooled themselves into believing something that was false, they might succeed in making excuses so that the entirety of their belief system is harmonious. But that wouldn't make the belief true. In fact, I'm not so sure that adults don't do this sometimes with Santa. Just take a look at Eric Kaplan's book, Does Santa Exist? A Philosophical Investigation, where he, and he's not kidding, puts forth an argument for Santa's existence and thinks it aligns with his experience. Such beliefs might be useful to some people, but not necessarily true. James himself may have recognized this fact when he said, "Any idea upon which we can ride, any idea that will carry us prosperously from one part of our experience to any other part, linking things satisfactorily, working securely, simplifying, saving labor, is true for just so much, true so far forth, true instrumentally." That last word is important. If it's true instrumentally, well, then it's useful. And yes, anything that unifies your experience and beliefs in this way is useful. But usefulness is not the same thing as truth. The second theory of truth I wish to consider is similar but slightly different. It's called the coherence theory of truth. According to this theory, to be true is to be entailed by a set of beliefs that are all coherent, that are logically consistent, that are able to be true together. Basically, on this theory, a true belief must be entailed by a set of beliefs that make sense. There are two ways of describing how the beliefs we hold are structured. One is called foundationalism. The idea is there are certain beliefs that we hold, which are so obviously true that they cannot be doubted, or at least we hope, that serve as the foundation for our belief system. The truth of these beliefs entails others, which entails others, which entails others, all the way up. In this way, all our knowledge is grounded on certain foundational, hopefully true, beliefs. We'll talk more about this theory later on in the course. Another model is proposed by the philosopher Willard Van Orman Quine, who described what he called a web of belief. All of our beliefs, he suggested, are related to each other in some way. My belief that I live in Pennsylvania reinforces my belief that I live in America. And my belief that science is the most reliable guide to truth leads me to doubt the existence of ghosts. What's more, certain beliefs are more important. They're more fundamental, we might say, in that they inform a great many other beliefs. Such beliefs are hard to dislodge. My belief that, say, no propositions can both be true and false would be such a belief for me. My belief that the world exists would be such a belief for me. Such beliefs, we could say, exist at the center of the web. My belief that it's going to rain tomorrow would lie somewhere on the outside of the web. It's informed by other beliefs in the web, but giving it up wouldn't require much or greatly affect the web. The coherence theory suggests that a belief is true if it is entailed by a coherent set of beliefs. Now, as someone builds their belief system, they might make mistakes so that a certain belief is not really justified by or is inconsistent with some other more central or fundamental view they hold. Such a belief would be inconsistent with the rest of their beliefs set, and thus, on the coherence theory, that belief would be untrue. If, however, a belief is entailed by a coherent belief set, then it is true. Now, a pretty obvious objection springs to mind at this point. The tale of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs is a coherent story. From that story, the following proposition follows. There is a prime number of dwarves that live in the forest. That belief is entailed by a coherent set, but obviously that's not true. So the coherence theory seems to get it wrong. To avoid this objection, coherentists observe that no one actually believes the story of Snow White. It's just a fairy tale. Coherence theory suggests that a belief is true only if it is entailed by an actual set of beliefs, a set of beliefs that someone actually holds. For propositions to be true, they must be entailed by sets of propositions that someone actually believes. But this leads to another problem, again inspired by Russell. Undeniably, some people believe the story of Christianity, which we will assume for the sake of the argument is consistent. Others believe the story of Islam. Again, let's assume consistency. Yet the former entails that Jesus is God, and the latter entails that Jesus is not God. Well, both suggestions can't be true, yet they are both entailed by a coherent set of beliefs. So again, it seems that coherentism is on the wrong track. Now, some coherentists reply to this by trying to refine what they mean by coherent set of beliefs and not identifying it with a set of beliefs of any one person. Harvard professor Hilary Putnam, for example, who I once, while a graduate student at Oklahoma, I took him on a tour of the Oklahoma Museum of Natural History. Anyway, he suggests that the set in question would be all the propositions that would be believed by persons like us after we have reached some kind of limit of inquiry, or learned all that we can know. Others, like modern philosopher J.O. Young at the University of Victoria, have suggested we think of it as the largest consistent set of propositions believed by all people. Their goal is to try to reduce the probability of the set being wrong by combining the cognitive powers of all humanity. Now, despite their efforts, however, we can still see a problem. No matter how smart we are, even combined, we could still get things wrong. Even given all that we have learned, we're still creatures with imperfect cognitive capacities. The mere fact that something is entailed by what humans have learned at their limit does not entail that it's true. Now, to avoid this objection, we might say that the set of propositions in question should be the one believed by an omniscient or all-knowing being. But such a being would believe a proposition because it is true. The proposition would not be true because it was believed by that being, or because it was entailed by what that being believed. So this leads us to our third theory of truth, the correspondence theory. The reason an omniscient being would believe something is true, that say the world is a certain way, is because the world is that way. What it means for a belief to be true is for it to accurately describe or correspond to the way the world is. The proposition, the book is on the table, is true in virtue of the fact that the book is on the table. It's so simple and obvious. This even seems to be the intuition that laid the foundation for the objections to the other theories. Peirce's pragmatist theory of truth fails because we might come to the wrong consensus. Because we are imperfect, we might all agree that something is true when in fact it does not match up to the way the world is. James' theory falls short because something can be useful but not accurately describe the world. And coherentism fails because a set of beliefs can be coherent without corresponding to the world. By my estimation, the correspondence theory of truth is one of the most well-grounded philosophical theories out there. When surveyed in the famous Phil Paper survey conducted by David Bourget and David Chalmers, half of all philosophers, said they accepted the correspondence theory, which is a pretty high percentage for such a disagreeable bunch. And in my humble opinion, those who accept other theories of truth are really just trying to redefine what truth means so they can still say that certain things are true, even though they know they don't correspond to the way the world is. Most certainly, the general public thinks things are true when they correspond to the way the world is. That's how they understand truth. And if we want our quest for truth to be useful for anyone outside of philosophy, we need to conceive of truth as they do. But That's not to say that accepting this theory doesn't raise a few problems. If the correspondence theory is true, or it's the correct one, then if a proposition does not accurately describe the way the world is, then it can't be true. So, what about propositions that don't describe the world at all, like moral statements? Intuitively, we think the proposition murder is wrong is true, but to what part of the world does that proposition correspond? A statement like the book is on the table has what we would call a truth maker, the physical state of the world of the book being on the table that we can actually point to. That's what makes that proposition true. But what is the truth maker for a moral proposition like murder is wrong? What could you point to show that it's a truth maker for that statement? Or what about counterfactual statements? Statements that express what would have occurred if the world were different than it is. Since these statements are saying that the world would be true if the world were different, and since truth consists in corresponding to the way the world actually is, clearly it can be difficult to find truth makers for counterfactual statements. For example, the statement, "If I didn't have a son, I wouldn't be as happy as I am." What piece of the world does that proposition correspond to make it true? Since I do have a son, we can't point to some part of the world where I don't have one to see how happy I am there and then compare that to how happy I am here. There is no state of the world right now where I don't have a son. But that doesn't make it false either. The alternate proposition, if I hadn't had a son, I would be happier than I am right now, would also need a truth maker. And yet the world that exists does not contain the state of affairs either. But one of those propositions has to be true. Either I would be happier or I wouldn't be. So, where are the truth makers? To solve this problem, philosophers appeal to something that will be important in later discussion. It's called possible worlds. Possible worlds are complete descriptions of another way the world could have turned out. To really be possible, it has to be a logically consistent description. It can't contain logical contradictions. But there are many possible worlds because there are many possible ways the world could have turned out. To say that if I hadn't had a son, I wouldn't be as happy as I am now, is to say that every possible world in which I do not have a son is also a possible world in which I am less happy than I am in the actual world. If that's so, then that fact about possible worlds serves as the truth maker for that counterfactual statement. But, again, a proposition's being true means it corresponds to the way the world actually is. If a counterfactual statement is really a statement about possible worlds, then wouldn't possible worlds have to really exist? Otherwise, what do counterfactuals correspond to? But wouldn't that mean that there is an actual existing possible world for every way the world could have been? A world where I don't have a son, a world where Gore won the 2000 election, a world where you are recording this lecture and I'm listening to the course, and on and on and on. Well, perhaps, and some philosophers actually believe this. The view is called modal realism, and it is most famously defended by the philosopher David Lewis. He thinks the ontological status of all worlds, the status of whether or not they actually exist, is equal. For us, our world is actual and other worlds are merely possible. But to the people that exist in other worlds, their world is actual and our world is merely possible. But, Lewis says, they all exist. Other philosophers think that possible worlds can be conceptual tools. In other words, they don't really exist apart from our conception of them, but can still serve as truth makers for counterfactual propositions. For example, maybe we can just think of them as collections of propositions. Maybe that's what a possible world is. But then we start wondering, well, collections of propositions, do propositions exist? Now, the debate on this issue is far too deep for the purposes of our course, and so we just need to leave the issue here. But at least later on, when I start talking about possible worlds, you'll have some idea about what I'm talking about. Okay, so we now have a working definition of truth, correspondence to the way the world is. And we have a few questions to consider later, like what could serve as truth makers for ethical statements. But With our working definition of truth in hand and our working definition of knowledge, justified true belief, we are now prepared to ask one of the biggest questions in all of philosophy. Is knowledge possible? Is it possible to have a justified true belief? It may seem that the obvious answer is yes, but as we will now see, and this is often the case in philosophy, things are not as obvious as they seem.